Hello and welcome to another episode of myNewsWrap. This is now episode 9, so we're nearly having a small anniversary next time. And this is a special edition because we are near Halloween, so I decided to adopt my background a bit to make it more spooky. Having said that, let's start with the news. What happened in the last week in the ecosystem of SAP and Microsoft and in the world between? Well, one important thing that I think came across your path anyway was the quarterly earning report of SAP after 3 quarters now this year of the financial year of 2020. I have linked here all the different news concerning that event. Basically because, shareholders were not that happy with what came along, and there have been quite some things to be discussed. There are several articles. Diginomica brought out some things, Handelsblatt, of course, Wirtschaftswoche, and so on and so forth. There is also an interview with SAP CEO Klein that I referenced here, where he clearly says, they knew what might happen if they announced what they announced concerning the high costs that they currently have with respect to bringing things into a cloud-native state or in a state where they could reasonably operate their offerings. I think from my perspective, it's a good move from SAP to put the mid and long term, so the sustainable goal on the front line, and do not just make the shareholders happy. So that's something that is really, I think, a very important message. I think it also shows that SAP has quite some homework to do when it comes to their cloud offerings in order to make them really manageable with a reasonable effort. And that's something that was reflected within the numbers that have been presented, and that's how it is. No matter, I think the message for customers is really good, because now I think they can move on from where they are and make things more sustainable, which will definitely benefit on customer side. Now there are some more news. Last week or the week before, SAP's Custom Experience Fair was presented, the SAP CX Live. There have been some announcements. One I already highlighted last week with respect to the customer data platform, and I referenced a little summary about the event that was presented here in the Customer Think area. So if you are around the customer experience area, I think this is an interesting read for you, especially also with respect to the strategic decisions and the stress that SAP now makes, that they are clearly focusing also on the CRM area. So something worth reading. Now let's go to the more technological area, SAP Cloud Platform. What happened last week? I have to say not too much. I'm afraid that within November maybe there is some draining of news by SAP, because they do not want to push out everything that they want to present at SAP TechEd. That's my perception. Let's see how it evolves next week. Nevertheless, there have been 3 blog posts that I want to highlight. 2 that have been published within a series of tutorials by Carlos Rogan, who focuses within this series on the serverless runtime of SAP Cloud Platform. It's quite extensive, so we are already at episode 12 and 13. And within episode 12 and 13, the topic is adding security. So how can you secure your function as a service offering on SAP Cloud Platform using XSUAA. The 12th episode, or the 12th part of this series, is more or less laying the foundation, how you use XSUAA together with functions as a service, whereas the 13th episode dives a bit deeper into the authentication area, especially when it comes to validation of the JUT token and handling the scoping and so on. So if you are around the function as a service area, I think a must read. Then there is another blog post that came across my path by Andre Fischer, which is quite interesting because I think there are now quite some blog posts by him that summarize the learnings that they have from customer workshops and also the OpenSAP RAP course that is currently taking place. And this one is, if you run into issues, especially with the ABAP trial account, it might be worth to delete and recreate your SAP Cloud Platform trial account. And well, this blog post describes step by step what you have to do if you run into problems and if you want to delete and recreate your SAP Cloud Platform trial account. So yeah, maybe helpful if you are around in the OpenSAP course, or if you're playing around with Steampunk on your own. Then let's switch to the area of the cloud application programming model. There is one very nice article by Pascal Wasem, who wrote a blog post about creating development containers for CDS in Visual Studio Code. Development containers are a quite useful tool if you want to have a containerized development environment. Now, why might you want to have something like that? Well, the reasons are outlined here within the blog. If you are in a project and you want everybody to have the same workspace tools and runtimes installed, then these containers are really valuable. Or if you have to have, or if you're working on different projects, or if you want to compare functionalities between different releases, you can containerize them and use them within Visual Studio Code. And this blog focuses on how to containerize your CDS development environment. So yeah, something quite cool. And I have to say, if you are in the CDS area, you should really think about making use of these development containers. Then another blog that I missed last week, so I brought it up this week, and it's about SAP Cloud Application Programming Model and maintaining annotations. Annotations are, well, kind of a topic because they can become quite complex, and especially in the UI5 area, you do not really know which annotations exist. You bring in typos quite easily, and you have not real tooling support. And this blog now describes how you can maintain annotations with the new language server protocol features within the CUP tooling in order to have things like highlighting, like code completion, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really super helpful for all those who are around the CUP area and work with annotations, which you probably automatically do, especially when you propagate your services to Fiori and Fiori elements. Then from CUP to Kyma, there is nothing too much new around Kyma. I think everybody has to settle with the new trial, but there is one thing in the, let's say, broader ecosystem around Kyma, namely Project Gardener. And there is a labs talk about a Project Gardener that is available. So if you are interested in that area, I think that's definitely a nice, valuable little podcast, because it takes you a little bit behind the let's say curtains of Kyma and how SAP is using and dealing with their Kubernetes clusters. And here I think Gardener is really a super valuable contribution, and it's also open source. So it's not restricted to the SAP ecosystem. Now, another blog post that came out that I would say is interesting within the area of SAP is has been published at Diginomica by Matthias Steiner. It's called Put an API-centric strategy at the heart of migrating your core platform. It's a quite interesting article. There is also a white paper linked within the article somewhere down below. This article is kind of highlighting an approach how you can make your move to S4HANA a bit more smooth by applying certain principles, mainly something like a facade or a anti-corruption layer in order to make your development future-proof. Of course, you have to take this article as well as the white paper with some kind of grain of salt, because Matthias is working for Neptune software, and of course the tool or the platform that is proposed in order to achieve that is Neptune. I have never worked with a Neptune software, so I cannot say if it's a fair approach or not. However, I think the ideas that are written down within this article and within the white paper are quite valuable, even if you do not work with Neptune software. What else do we have? One interesting blog, which is kind of a proof of concept from the area of SAP Cloud Platform integration by Raphael Herrmann, is he kind of managed to run .NET Core, so C# on SAP CPI. This blog is quite interesting because it shows that I think there is quite some demand to open up the ecosystem also to .NET or .NET Core. It's feasible, so it's possible, but it's really not production ready. It's far away from that. But if you are around the CPI area, if you are a .NET developer, I think something quite funny to try out. Yeah, that's it from the SAP part of the house. From the Microsoft part of the house, there was also the announcement of the for Microsoft second quarter results, because Microsoft has a shifted financial year, so they are now at the end of the second quarter in contrast to SAP. At the end of the first quarter, pardon me. And well, for Microsoft, the cloud business is growing. But that's nothing that's surprising, because the cloud business of Microsoft is much more diverse than the one of SAP, as they have Microsoft 365 with Teams. They have the Power Platform that gained quite some attention during the COVID-19 crisis now. And so just for the sake of completeness, because I brought up the numbers of SAP, I also wanted to highlight the numbers of Microsoft that are growing. Then another more generic news about Microsoft, indirectly about Microsoft. ThoughtWorks brought out the new Technology Radar edition, where they put on the radar, put on the spotlights on techniques, tools, platforms, and languages you might want to take a look at, you might want to adopt, and they give some recommendations on that. And within the platform area, there is within the trial quadrant, or within the trial area, they highlighted Azure DevOps. So something that, it's not fully recommended to adopt, but something that could be tried out, and if it fits, you can use it. So that's quite nice. From the tooling perspective, there's also something in the same area of adoption, that's Dependabot. So that's a bot that checks your dependencies within GitHub, for example, and tells you if a new version came out of a dependency. Now you might say, what has this to do with Microsoft? Well, Dependabot was acquired by GitHub, and GitHub was acquired by Microsoft. So that's how the story goes. And last but not least, if you are working in the area of .NET, then it might be interesting for you that Blazor comes up within the assess area. So it's quite new, this Blazor thingy, and it's already within the assess area of this ThoughtWorks technology rollout. That's, I think, quite interesting. Then to my beloved Azure Functions. It was a great month for Azure Functions. Why? Because we had the Azure Functions Live and a lot of announcements within Azure Functions Live, which was also quite professionally themed with respect to Halloween. What do I want to highlight? Well, VS Code Azure Functions extension is now available in version 1.0, and there is one super cool feature in there, and that's the OpenAPI triggers. So you can create your Azure functions, including all the routing, with an OpenAPI specification. That was known under the working title of Project Standstill, and that's now GA within the newest Azure Function extension version. Then another quite interesting thing for the new for the Open Function App specification, I also referenced the official update from the Microsoft side here so that you can see how this works. Then there was another interesting part within the announcement of product management, namely that there will be a retry policy for Azure Functions. And I have to stress Azure Functions, not Azure Durable Functions. With Azure Durable Functions, you already had retry policies quite some time. Now that's also possible for single functions. So if you hook up a function to an, let's say, Event Hub or a Cosmos DB, and the function execution fails, you can do a retry within the function. Documentation is not yet rolled out, so it might not be available yet, but so this is something that will be coming out in the next weeks, let's say 1 or 2 weeks. Another point that was quite interesting that I was not aware of is when it comes to the premium plan of Azure Functions, which is not the consumption plan, but well, something that you usually use if you want to avoid the cold start phenomenon within Azure Functions, which gives you some pre-warmed instances of your Azure Functions that you can configure. And there is one functionality that's called a warm-up trigger, which is called when your function is warmed up, which allows you to do some initialization work within your functions. If you're interested in that one, look at the specific section within the video, because there is a demo clearly showing what this means if you do it and if you don't do it when it comes to pre-warmed functions, because otherwise you might run into an issue that looks like a cold start, but is no cold start, but is simply due to the fact that you do some initialization within your function. And this also has to be done within the warming up of the function. And for those of you who use durable functions, a new release is out with quite some bug fixes and with a new partition management strategy that's quite useful, yeah, especially if you run Azure Durable Functions in production, because otherwise you might run into issues with your storage. So that's it from Azure Functions, from the news from product management. There are also some interesting and I would say real life blogs, not from a sandbox, but from real life with respect to the usage of Azure Functions. The first one that I want to bring up is using Azure Functions in order to sync Cosmos DB collections. So Cosmos DB is the, as you probably know, cloud native database offering on Microsoft Azure, and it's the collections are kind of the let's say containers that you use, and they are read optimized, or should be read optimized. Otherwise, the fetching of data may take quite some time. And this might be one scenario where you have different, let's say, collections that are optimized for different querying models, and you want to sync them, and you can use Azure Functions for that. And that's described within this blog post quite extensively. Another scenario where Azure Functions were used together with Azure Static Web Apps was the Collab Days Benelux event. And this blog that I've referenced wraps up what they used and for streaming, which is also quite interesting, but also what they used behind the scenes with respect to the website and how they make use of Azure Static Web Apps and Azure Functions. So that's really interesting, and they also give some outlook on the traffic that was managed with this setup. Then one other blog post that's quite interesting is bringing together Azure Functions with the Azure SDK for cognitive services. A real life scenario where you can see already here from the let's say architecture outline. It's not a easy peasy sandbox layout having one function in there, but really several Azure functions that are collaborating with several other Azure functionality, Azure services that are used in order to leverage cognitive services with respect to recorded audio, video, or chat history or something like that. So that's, really interesting read and another really nice use case when it comes to Azure Functions. Then one last thing concerning Azure Functions, especially when you use them within a Kubernetes cluster. KEDA 2.0 release candidate 2 is out, or was released 7 days ago. So I think KEDA 2.0 will be nearing productive release soon. They have made quite some improvements, some bug fixing, of course, as usual within a release candidate. And there are some new features also implemented within the release candidate too. For example, here, a new scalar option for IBM MQ. So that's also quite good news at the end of the year. So there are quite some stuff coming out for functions as well as for functions in combination with Kubernetes. Now, I have said something about customer experience on the SAP area. I also want to highlight one thing that came out with respect to customer experience and Microsoft, kind of mirroring the news of SAP. And there is quite some partnering going on between Microsoft, Adobe, and C3 AI in order to, marketing speech, reinvent CRM as usual. If something new comes out, nevertheless, a quite interesting approach. And why I also highlighted this article is there is again a reference to the Open Data Initiative, ODI. And if you remember that initiative, SAP was part of that. I think it still is part of that. But the news that I read about the Open Data Initiative is always about Adobe and Microsoft. So I'm quite curious if SAP will kind of join that one initiative again actively, or if they will do their own stuff, because I think the things that Microsoft is currently doing with respect to, let's say, the Health Cloud as well as to CRM are really kind of direct, I wouldn't say offenses, but they are kind of competing solutions. And I think there has to be some solution, and I would be sad if the partnering between SAP and Microsoft would kind of suffer under these competitions. There is also another blog, also from a, let's say, real life scenario, namely from Walmart. And this blog post extensively describes how Walmart built up their e-commerce business based on Microsoft Azure with Cosmos DB and Kubernetes. So AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service. So this is really quite interesting from my perspective to read. If you are interested in building scalable platforms. Now, that was it from the Microsoft area. I also have some points from the area in between SAP and Microsoft. There is one thing that I missed last week that I simply forgot to bring up. That was the SAP on Azure video podcast episode 13. As you can see here, it's a quite lengthy episode, nearly an hour. And if you take a look at the agenda, there are a lot of demos in there with respect to integration scenarios between SAP and Microsoft using logic apps, sending iDocs, using Azure API management, and using cognitive services. And the one that demoed all that stuff was Bartosz Jakowski. He's someone who also writes blog posts extensively on the SAP community. So if you're interested in this integration area between SAP and Microsoft, I would highly recommend to watch this episode of SAP on Azure. Then there is another news which is of interest for you if you are working with logic apps and use the SAP connector, because the help documentation was updated or enhanced with a quite extensive section about troubleshooting these connectors, because as you can certainly imagine, it's not that easy to hook that up, and errors can occur, errors will occur, and it's not super easy to find errors within logic apps in combination with such a connector. So this troubleshooting reference should be really helpful to all the guys and girls who use logic apps with the SAP connector. Yeah, that's it from the world in between, from the world between SAP and Microsoft concerning integration topics. There is one thing that I want to highlight with respect to, let's say, educational stuff. I don't know if you're aware of that. Microsoft offers for free a lot of hands-on labs. They are offered currently as a remote experience. They are free. And what's interesting, if you miss them, you don't have time for them because of whatsoever, all the information is available within Microsoft's GitHub repository. And I've referenced here one thing, and that's Cloud Native in a day. Focus is, of course, if it's Cloud Native, it's Kubernetes. I don't know why they don't do serverless in a day. At least I did not find a workshop on that. But this is really quite extensive material and gives you, well, a quite smooth ride into the area of Cloud Native with the offering on Microsoft Azure. So if you're interested on that, take a look at it. Maybe you're waiting for SAP TechEd news. There are no news up to now, so I don't think that registration is open already. I did not see it. So I hope I have some news next week about SAP TechEd, because it's only, well, approximately 1 month away. And I would say it would be also helpful for SAP to know how many want to attend. Then one blog post that I want to highlight that comes, let's say, from the area of tooling in the broadest sense and productivity by Lukasz Gornicki. Those of you who have been active in the area of Kyma know him because he was part of the Kyma core team, and he's now working, I think, for Async API, and he is really super active in the open source area. And there was a big hackathon taking place, I think 2 weeks ago, a week or 2 week long open source contribution event. And he brought up one thing that was important for him, and that was analyze sentiments in issues and PR requests and get notified if they occur. So he integrated functionality within his GitHub flows in order to get notified if a PR request gets issued, which might be offensive because this is something that's not very, well, it's not nice, first of all. And second of all, especially the open source community is really caring about this being open, being inclusive. And yeah, I think that's something quite worth reading. And if you have open source projects, I think quite worth adopting. Yeah, that's it from the, let's say, technological part. And as a finisher, I have somebody I want to draw your attention to. I already drew your attention to him when I talked about SAP on Azure, and that's Bartosz Jakowski. That's somebody you should follow. Well, he's on LinkedIn, he's on Twitter, he is on the SAP community, because he writes really great contributions, great blog posts when it comes to SAP and Azure. Don't be confused by the title SAP on Azure. It's some blogs are about infrastructure, but most of the blogs are about integration scenarios, as you can see here, like exporting data to Azure Data Lake, or easy integration using Azure Logic Apps. So really great content that he delivers. If you are interested in that area, you should follow him. Now, that was it for this week for my news wrap on SAP and Microsoft. I hope I had some news for you, some new food for the brain. Well, I would say I see you next week. Have a nice Friday, have a nice weekend. Until then, bye.